Thank you for joining me at the Politico Competitive Europe Summit. I'm Francesca Micheletti. I'm Politico's competition correspondent. Today, we are going to talk about the EU's alliance with the US and how this has evolved over the past year, which has been incredibly tense. Things are changing, things are shifting. To the point that our own enforcement is being put up for discussion. I'm thinking of antitrust rules, for example, because this is the topic that I follow more closely, which are being discussed and debated in the context of a tense transatlantic relationship. To help me analyze these issues and the way forward today, we are happy to welcome Senator Mario Monti. Former Italian Prime Minister, but also former EU Commissioner twice for Internal Market and Competition. So welcome.
Pleasure to be there.
Great. So Senator Monti, you have witnessed a lot of the European Commission's history. So my first question to you would be, are you surprised at the state, especially of the EU-US relations today? Have we seen it all before during your time? What has changed?
Well, what has changed, unfortunately, is the broad picture of the relationship between the US and the EU, which is now much more ambivalent. Let me say this, and this casts some shadow also on the way we deal with specific issues and cases in various policy areas which might be contentious with the US. This is nothing new. You mentioned the times when I was Competition Commissioner. At that time, the US, up to President George W. Bush, were deeply disconcerted when the European Union, the Commission, prohibited the merger between GE and Honeywell, and separately put a fine and imposed a change in the business model of Microsoft for abuse of its dominant position. There were tensions, big tensions, but then they were solved through a mutual deepening of the topics and the admission that there were margins of autonomy within a broad common framework for different decisions on both sides of the Atlantic. Now it's different, but now it's particularly important, in my view, that the Commission does not give up those few instruments where it really has, within Europe, federal powers given to them by the member states, like competition and trade.
So it was easier, would you say it was easier to find Microsoft in 2004 than it is to find Google today for antitrust violations?
Well, simply the reaction. Now, well, let me put it this way. No, there is no difference in the difficulty. In both cases, the Commission had and has to withstand powerful pressures, but that is part of the job. The difference is that now the US has a president who does not admit fully the sovereignty of other parts of the world. He immediately criticized the Commission on the day of the fine on Google because in his view, this was a discrimination against American companies, not at all. And the Commission here, I mean, in this case, like always, simply applied the laws that are there in Europe, very similar to those in the US on competition, that we all learned from the US, the Sherman Act of 1890 and subsequently. And I remember that when we fined Microsoft in 2004, many people came to support our action. Most vividly, Eric Schmidt, then the CEO of a 3 or 4 year old startup called Google, because by so doing, we prevented Microsoft from stifling innovation and preventing Google to breathe on the market.
So it sounds as if we need to remember history to try and make sense of what's happening today. Now I would like to cast our glance forward. So what would be your recommendation? How do we go from here? How do we make sure that this relationship with the US keeps being a smooth one? And what would be your vision?
Well, MAGA is an important phenomenon. I respect it. But I believe, at least for the time being, it will not stop the world from existing. And I think the EU and many other countries in the world which still believe in the rule of law, openness, and multilateralism should present themselves to the US as still deeply friends and feeling like the curators of the legacy, the great legacy of the US, which led the world before this recent abdication from leadership on, for example, multilateralism to manage global public goods like public health, climate, biodiversity, open trade, etc. So the EU, and more specifically its member states, because not necessarily all of the EU would be, or not necessarily all EU member states would subscribe to this, should shape an alliance among like-minded countries, in particular taking care of the global agenda on public goods. It's not that we can now afford not to have a global common fight against pandemics, for example, or against trafficking of drugs and of people simply because there is MAGA over the Atlantic. So there should be a joint venture. I see a great role here for the UK, by the way, which would apply the principle of the coalition of the willing, where the UK has been a leader recently, also beyond the sphere of security, because the long-term security of the world depends not only on weapons and the use that is done of those, but also on how we take care of public goods like financial stability, free trade, and the other ones that I mentioned earlier.
We have 1 more minute, and I was curious to elaborate on something we mentioned in preparing this conversation about the trade aspects. So we mentioned the difference between the trading goods and trading services, and you had some interesting ideas on that, how we can leverage more on services.
Yes, of course, in a nutshell, the EU has a surplus in the trade of goods, and President Trump has called the EU to apologize for this in forms of tough tariffs on the goods flowing from the EU to the US. But the US have, of course, a huge surplus in services, financial services, digital services, and others. So I believe that exactly in the spirit that President Trump, admittedly with stronger powers, but he's still a human being like all of us, we could well argue that not only we should not give up our power of control over, for example, regulation or the application of antitrust principles to the digital or to financial services, but we should maybe preserve our position there more vigorously. And I was very much impressed, I must say, by the statement of the US ambassador to the EU yesterday, where he went as far as saying that the European Union should give proof that what it does in these areas does not discriminate against the US or against freedom of speech of US citizens. I think the burden of the proof is on those who complain, and I believe that in Europe we also care a lot about freedom of speech. And I'm not sure that we can take lessons on this from the current US administration, given the quickness with which it removes from the public administration in the US, but also from private companies in the US, people who have said or written things which are not liked by the administration. This is not exactly free speech, I believe.
Thank you. And I'm sure you will continue debating these issues in the next panel, for which I welcome my colleague, Koen Verhelst. And the panel is on alliances, partnerships, and relationships. Who can Europe trust?